Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pathfinder, a podcast by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. My guest today is Malory McLemore, the CEO and co-founder of Stell, an LA-based startup building requirements management for systems engineers. Malory, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast, Mo. I'm so excited to be here.
Where are you calling in from today?
I'm in the Stell office. We're in Marina del Rey in Los Angeles.
Is that where you're originally from?
No, I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and my parents are always trying to convince me to move the company back to Alabama.
All right. Well, we're gonna talk about that for sure. But maybe just to kick us off, why don't you give us a little bit of background on Stell, what you're building, and really how you got here?
Yeah, so Stell is really born out of my own frustration from years of working as an aerospace engineer and feeling like I had subpar software tooling to do my job. I started researching this in business school in 2020 and have been super excited to fully start working on it and launch the business in the last year. I've really honed in on solving the problem of helping aerospace companies manage kind of from mission contractual requirements all the way through, sending requirements down their supply chain and managing that complex compliance moment on these super difficult programs.
And Stell has been around for how long?
About a year and a half. We incorporated at the end of October 2022.
So I know before that you've held a number of different roles in aerospace. Maybe tell us about how you got into the industry and what was your career arc?
Yeah, so I was super nerdy in school and I just loved math and science. I started in biomedical engineering and found that to be like a lot of memorization actually of like the chemistry and biology. And so switched to aerospace my second year of college at Alabama. And yeah, just really loved like statics, dynamics, and kind of thrived there. And I started my career at Airbus Commercial Aircraft. So I actually did engineering for cabin down in Mobile, Alabama. Airbus was like really building up their facilities there. It was like a really exciting time. And I actually got to go all over the country, like building things like new business class seats, new like Delta Airlines Wi-Fi. It was such a cool job to see like the interior of a completely empty A380 is like a ballroom. So super exciting like commercial aviation experience there. And then I worked a little bit on the defense side. I was a quality engineer at Raytheon. Um, I shouldn't say too much about what I worked on there, but something in missile defense. And I was kind of like final touch in the factory on QAing like the device and lots of paperwork for the customer. And then more recently, I was an intern at Anduril during my MBA, trying to kind of learn a little bit about business development and defense. And then I was a product manager at Hadrian before starting Stell.
So I do have a quick tangent to ask you. So you went to Harvard Business School, and what I've learned and seen is that there's a growing curriculum around space at HBS. I don't know if it existed while you were there, but I'm curious if since you were there and I don't know how closely you follow the program today, but what have you noticed in terms of there's this growing interest in space? And I've spoken to the dean and a couple of the professors there who are building a space curriculum, and it's actually quite exciting to see. Obviously one of the most important academic institutions doing something like this. So I don't know what have you seen in your time there?
Yeah, to me, HBS was like the space business school. And when I was applying in 2019, they were the only school with a space club. And I thought that was so cool. And they had pictures of like people in astronaut costumes at a party. And I was like, oh, this is great. Because all the other business schools were like very heavy consulting, banking, and VC. And I kind of knew I didn't want to go down one of those career paths. The school is, I think, really strong on this front and only got stronger when I was there. So Professor Weinzierl and Brendan Rousseau, they really like championed the program. We actually had this like space economics course my second year. And then actually my co-founder and I, we were co-presidents of the Space Club. And we barely kept this club alive during the pandemic. But during the end of our like second year, it was 2022, we we actually launched the Tech and National Security Conference, and I still go back to that every year. So it's really shifted the conversation from like commercial aviation, which it used to be, to like defense tech and space and that intersection, which is seeing a lot of investment this year.
Why do you think there's a growing interest in not just the academic institutions, but just like, I mean, the students? And to your point, that conference that you've mentioned, I keep hearing more and more about, and obviously it's becoming a much bigger staple in the industry.
Yeah, well, I think a feeling I've had for a long time is like I was frustrated by career options that were kind of like consulting engagements or tech where you like ship a new button on this kind of like consumer app. Like that always lacked meaning and purpose to me. And I think a lot of people in our culture and in business, they want to go do something with impact. And we're seeing kind of the global implications of aerospace. I think like commercially, my co-founder and I, we like get excited about all these new space stations and like the possibility of research for humanity. And then also like on the defense side, just how important these products are going to be to like kind of freedom in the West for the next 20 to 30 years. And coming to work with that mission, it is just so much more fun and like building a team around that versus kind of like we're here to make money and build this kind of like fun app. And I think a lot of people at HBS and then just like in the space in general feel that lately.
Tell me a little bit about how your previous jobs played a role in where Stella is today, or helped you kind of think about the idea.
I would say like I was never like the best like aerospace engineer in terms of like designing a new plane or or rocket and like drawing it on a piece of paper and CAD. But like in these larger companies, what actually ends up taking a lot of the business's time and pain is like processes and coordination. And I just thrived in these kind of really crazy environments where communication had maybe broken down. And like at Airbus, my role was called like engineering liaison. And so I would actually make like Excel sheets and kind of come up with like lo-fi processes to solve this problem. And even at Raytheon, I just loved the kind of they call it like Lean Six Sigma as a methodology, but really looking at no one comes to work to do a bad job, but what are the incentive structures and the processes that led to the business challenges and then trying to solve those. And Stell is just the ultimate manifestation of my work doing this my whole life.
Can I ask a question around one of Airbus's competitors, Boeing? So you might know where I'm going with this. So Boeing has had a number of issues, and most recently, their door blew off while in flight. And maybe I'm stretching here, but I'm kind of curious. Like, does tools like what you're building, is that supposed to like help make sure that that doesn't happen? It just kind of seems like they're what in your I don't know, I don't know if you've actually spent any time looking at this, but like what in your mind is the breakdown where a company like Boeing could have a new airplane model, and for it to have so many issues, right? Like what do you think? I don't know. I don't know if I'm asking the right question, but I think what I'm really curious is, like, from your perspective, um, how could that be improved?
Yeah, so my brain like immediately goes into root cause analysis. And, if I was working at Boeing, like, when I was a quality engineer, this was my job to solve these kind of failures. Usually they were earlier on in production versus at a customer. But yeah, I think there was clearly a breakdown in design because your design should have a lot of robustness to withstand any kind of normal fluctuations in manufacturing. I think like on the manufacturing floor, like however those bolts were kind of checked, I don't know the details of that design, so I won't get into that, but like that's processes, paperwork, tools, and also culture. And then yeah, I think it goes back to like this extremely complex coordination problem. Like I don't know if Boeing would have even designed that door. I'm sure they didn't manufacture it because they're working with suppliers. And I think it's really hard because like a lot of communication with suppliers is PDFs, it's meetings, it's Excel sheets, and we're human beings. And these are extremely complex products and mistakes, are made. And that's why having like a really strong safety culture, really strong tooling, like all of those can shore up and strengthen your programs to lead to prevent these outcomes. I I like to tell like a story from Airbus because I think it really solidifies like what does safety culture mean. Like when I started there, I'm coming out of college and I'm like, okay, we're building airplanes, we're selling airplanes, we need to make money, we need to deliver them on time. And I remember we had this in a crew rest compartment. There was a piece of Velcro that wasn't flammability certified. This plane was painted, it was sitting on the runway, it's ready to go. We were losing $100,000 a day not delivering this aircraft, but we held it because we needed to like run the flammability test on this piece of Velcro and know that it would like be survivable. And that as a new grad, I was like just absolutely floored by this, and it really set the tone of how I acted as an engineer the rest of my career.
So let's talk a little bit about the need for Stell in not just the space industry, but the aerospace industry and beyond. How have companies operated in the past, and why should a company work with Stell?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of like two modes of operation. So some companies have legacy tools like IBM Doors. And I think these tools, they originated in the 90s. They're extremely robust and customizable and very complex. And my experience on the ground being trained in these tools and like seeing them on programs is they're so complex that most of the team just kind of churns off of them and goes to Excel sheets, especially because you have to communicate with your suppliers or your supply chain team. They're not logging on to Doors. And so you see like this very, very siloed tool use, which leads to the tool being used as an audit record instead of something that actually helps the engineers, which I think needs to get fixed as soon as possible. And and then the other thing is I think we see customers, yeah, just using Excel sheets or like Jira tickets. They are solving the problem in whatever way they can. And that starts to break down when you have a lot of new programs, you're growing. And then I think we're seeing people do more with less talent because talent has become extremely tight and limited. And so using something like Stell helps you coordinate, helps you move faster and prevent defects because we have these really fine grained controls of like, how are you changing your requirements?
So you are a startup, right? And how many people work on the team today?
We're 6 people.
Okay, amazing. So you're 6 people. So like what are the initial products that you're offering companies today? And maybe talk a little bit about your product roadmap. What does that look like over time?
Yeah, with pre-seed and a startup, you have to be super focused on delivering something very quickly. It has to be very tight so you can actually be super successful. And so after over 100 customer interviews, and Isaac and I, we realized like requirements management was a great beachhead because people were on Excel, they were in pain. And so we had a first signed customer last summer and we shipped something in 2 months. Um, and so that was like,
That's
honestly,
amazing.
it was barely functional and we hated it, but it worked. And that customer stuck with us and helped us iterate like every week, which was amazing. And now we have a pretty feature complete, pretty slick requirements management tool, which we're really happy with. We have, another 6 months of like dreams that we want to incorporate into that to make it really fun and like delightful for engineers. But that's kind of like our off the shelf product offering. And then the big push for this summer is connecting this requirements compliance tool with a shared supplier customer space. So instead of just internal to my company working on one of these files, being able to actually share that down in the supply chain or even back to a customer. So we're not creating that extreme data loss, email a PDF type of moment. And there's nothing on the market like this right now. Like there's just a couple of tools that are basically like a Dropbox or a folder for PDFs.
Right. And what is the business model of Stell? Like how are you making money?
Yeah, so we sell annual licenses of the software and we sell them in tiers. So we sell like, a set of 1 to 25 licenses. And we did this on purpose because the legacy tool is almost $7,000 a user a year. And it creates that siloed behavior because they say, oh, well, we have the one license, we can't afford more. Only this one person can be on the tool. Stell wants to kind of democratize access to this data set so that it really can grow and be useful. So that's why we've done this tiered licensing.
What is your ideal customer look like today? What are the what would you say are the types of companies or the profile of companies that you want to be taking on right now?
Yeah, so we call them kind of like mid-tier aerospace companies, so not the startups necessarily, and not, the C-suite of like a Northrop Grumman right now. Um,
Hmm.
and I think like two of our early partners, Blue Canyon and Firefly, like really represent well kind of our ideal customer profile. So I'd say they're past like a Series B type of funding and like a first couple of prototypes. They are scaling, and then they have some exposure to what I call like old space and defense. So they're really having to deal with, you know, they're delivering a rocket or a satellite, but they're also having to deliver this compliance documentation to get paid. That's really our ideal customer profile and who we solve the most pain for.
What have you found so far that has worked, or what selling point, I should say, that's worked best in converting customers from, let's call it the old way of requirements to kind of adopting your process?
I think it's just delight and that the workflow works how they expect it to. So we designed requirement sets to look like a document, like a Notion, and it has these really fine grained like status changes, comments, controls, which engineers' eyes just like light up when we show them how the like change cycles work. And then we have matrix view, which you can see on our website, but it's the engineer's action view, and it is like a supercharged Excel. So really like lightweight linking, like an Airtable, and you're able to create these views that quickly move you through a program, and you can kind of see what still needs to be done.
Have you ever quantified the a dollar value of the inefficiency of doing business the more in the traditional way, like is there a way that you can like maybe sit in front of a potential customer and say, hey, look, because of the way you're doing business and the way your engineers are managing requirements, like you are like this is how much more productive you can be by working with us. Like how do you quantify that?
Yeah, so it really depends on the customer and the program. But, if I was leading one of these businesses, the two ways I would do it is one, like risk management. So if you have a missed requirement or a design change that isn't fully controlled, that can lead to a hardware design that needs to be changed after like a PDR. And I've seen that on the ground happen on most programs I've ever been on. So this is not an uncommon mistake, and that's usually a $1 to $5 million issue to like take the program back. You're now late. You're paying all the engineering dollars to like redesign and then scrapping any kind of like hardware progress you had made because you have to contend with the real world. It's not software and agile. You kind of have to go back to that starting point you were at. And yeah, two, I think there's a harder to quantify cost to talent. I mean, I think a lot of people leave the primes and old aerospace because they spend most of their time doing paperwork. Like the tools are so frustrating, is frankly. And so I think like if we want good talent, we should have great tools which feel more like, they're working with you versus against you.
Are you targeting the government at all at any point?
Yes, yes. We've had like a 6 month research project and kind of like outreach campaign to really just learn, especially about Space Force and Air Force. There's a couple of groups that I think have like a strong mandate and interest in kind of digital engineering and tooling. The first is like Space Systems Command. And with this new kind of like tactically responsive space, very rapid launch profile, like if you want to bring on all these new launch providers and rapidly integrate them, if you're trying to do that on doors and like emailing PDFs, that's going to be extremely difficult. And then the Air Force also has an initiative called Digital Material Management. And Anne and I just spent a week in Orlando with this working group. And there's so much pain, especially around that sharing that I spoke about. So being in a common environment with the engineering compliance between Air Force and the satellite or launch provider. Um, the industry is just really keen to have something like this, and it doesn't exist today.
Yeah. How did you and Anne team up? What was the catalyst to help you guys decide that you wanted to work together on this?
Yeah, so we were like the really lame people at Harvard that were into like space. So we were co-presidents of the space club, and which was like extremely hard during the pandemic. We were trying to like get people to watch launches on Zoom, like drinking a beer. You can imagine how popular that was. Um, and Anne wanted to be actually an investor in space. And so I was always pitching her my ideas and I would show her my designs. And we actually called customers together for a couple of classes. And beyond that, she was just my friend. Like when I when I decided to leave Hadrian, she was one of the first people I called, and she was like, "Oh, I'll help you." We just kind of started working together. We didn't have the co-founder conversation till 2 weeks in working on the project.
Wow. And since then, how have you guys built out the team? What has been your strategy around the types of hires that you look for?
Yeah, I think the team culture is very important, and that feels very trite, but we're very open. We build in public. We're very transparent, and so anyone that joins the team, kind of operating in that environment and really coming with solutions, sharing ideas, like that's very important to working at Stell. Structurally, Anne and I do all of like the business development, sales. You'll see us at all the conferences, just going out and speaking to everyone. I was really architect of the product during V1, but that is now shifting to the team. The team is very technical, mostly software engineering. Even our product designer, she was a software engineer before, so she's bringing that heavy technical background to Stell. A mix of experience from like SpaceX, AWS, and then like more startup-y background.
As you kind of build this team, you mentioned culture earlier. I'm curious, how much of your team is remote versus in person?
This is a very tough question for startups, and Anne and I talk about this every 6 months. We are not fully remote, and we
Hmm.
don't intend to be for the near future. But we have built this kind of hybrid culture. So we have the LA office and the San Francisco office, both like little co-working spaces like this. And everyone is supposed to be here 3 days a week, and you're kind of Monday, Friday, very flexible. If you have an appointment, it's flexible, go
Yeah.
to that. And we find that really great for, I think, maintaining the relationships and speed and rigor while also, most of our team were in our 30s and 40s. So having that work life balance is really important.
And as far as industry is concerned, right now you're focused on aerospace. Are you thinking beyond aerospace?
Yes, definitely. I think we say like aerospace defense is our core ICP, and we'll probably stay focused there just again to have that hyper focus and ship product extremely quickly. But really, any company that has a burden of heavy compliance hardware, so they're contending with the real world and whatever they're making, and then compliance is going to be able to use a requirements management tool. Medical devices is probably the next most obvious market, but I think anything in terms of like nuclear, advanced automotive, even chip fab and things like that can use requirements management tools. So that would be on our longer term roadmap.
How do you, let's talk about competition for a second. So, how do you differentiate from other engineering collaboration tools? And you did mention earlier that, you know, there was not really much out there in terms of product offering in terms of what you guys are building. How do you think about the other tools? And do you think that they can coexist with one another? Is the market big enough?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the market and that it's software for hardware tools. There are a lot of huge companies, and there's a big market to date, across SAP, IBM, Autodesk. We just saw a huge acquisition of Ansys. I think that was 2 weeks ago. So I think in terms of like overall software for hardware, there's a very large market, and that makes me excited because obviously we've shipped a requirements management tool this year, but the long term of what we could provide with that data and kind of sitting on top of that initial product is huge. And I think there's, even outside of like the core CAD tools, like there's so much clunky tooling inside these primes, like that they make themselves. And I saw that firsthand that these startups can come in and really have a much better product for these companies. And I think ultimately it'll be very good for aerospace engineers. And yeah, in terms of, I know there are in the last 2 years, a number of startups that have emerged and gone after the requirement space. I I mean, I think we're all on that same pain point, right? There's clearly a need. In terms of how Stell's positioned, and like I won't speak to like what any of them are or aren't doing. I can say what we are or aren't doing. So we are super focused on not being a super user tool. So we don't design for the systems engineer to do this like super complicated parametric analysis, which is like, adding kind of the equations and the math into how the requirements are built out. We think the industry actually needs something more simple versus more complicated, which that's a bet, right? Because there are engineers out there that would disagree with that, and they do love these complex tools. Our plan is to sit alongside like a Cameo or like a Pruitt Ridge, like a parametric analysis kind of tool. So we're kind of not going after that market head on. I think also the supply chain component really differentiates us. I think most of the tools are going after that development process within a company, whereas we are really focused on documentation and sharing across with the suppliers. What else to go through? I think too, like we were not super focused on selling to startups. We did speak to a lot of startups in the beginning, and if any of the founders or engineers are listening, like thank you for speaking to Anne and I and like giving us all of your input. But I think a lot of the startups are selling to other startups, and we found that you have to build something really sophisticated and delightful and detailed to serve that profile. And we found kind of an easier to go after pain point in that compliance workflow and more old space. That was a really underserved need. So we've been more focused there.
Do you think that as these companies scale and grow, do you think they start to look similar? Do you think that there's certain sandboxes that people start to enter into? Other sandboxes, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of people that say like the winner could potentially buy the others, but I don't think any kind of winner has emerged yet out of the startup cohort that would have enough cash to actually do acquisitions of the others. I also think like generally the market guides what should be built. So yes, like I expect some of these ideas which are super early and unvalidated will end up going after a product that starts to work. So yeah, I do think there will be some run in, but yeah, generally the founders all have very different ideas about how hardware should be built, how the tools should be designed. Like I think a lot of these firms, I see a lot of like AI will write your requirements, which is one thing I really disagree with. I I don't think an LLM should generate the like specs for a spacecraft or a launch vehicle or really any of this hardware. I think that's what the engineer is for, and I think the way I think about it at Stell is like AI is a co-pilot for the engineer. Like we're working on really sophisticated search and kind of bringing documents to your fingertips based on keywords. But things like that, where that company is clearly going after a very different strategy than Stell, and we'll see what the market what the market says about which of these approaches is right.
Talk a little bit about your pre-seed round, which I know wasn't too long ago, but how was that process, and how has it been working with those investors?
Yeah, so we raised 3.2 million in December 2022, and Nicole Wishoff actually led our round. We met her the first week, and she's a solo GP. We were the first lead check out of her second fund, and she was just incredible. Like in terms of coming to the meeting prepared, she works hard. She does a lot of like social media and just network building. And Anne and I were in that scrappy stage of our business, and we just thought this is such a good match in terms of like hustle and like surviving this early stage. Like she really gets it, and she's been an amazing partner for us. And then she actually introduced us to Third Prime. They're out of Nashville and New York, and they came in as a co-lead and wrote a $1.5 million check. And they bring that heavy private equity, aerospace and defense background, which is great too at the early stage because you're always thinking about how am I building a real business that's going to exit and be extremely profitable, which was important to Anne and I.
Do you have any current fundraise plans?
We are super excited about the momentum that we had at the end of last year with the onboarded design partners, the initial tool being really robust. We have a lot of go to market motions, which are now in full swing. And so, yeah, I think anyone interested in kind of talking to us at this inflection point should reach out.
So when speaking to an investor, potential investor, what is the grand vision that you want them to help understand? Like, what is, to paint like maybe an extreme point, like what does a world look like if every hardware engineering team is using Stell?
Yeah, so I want Stell to be the Atlassian of hard tech. And I think we can have our own tooling suite because of the uniqueness of the industry. I think we're entering a hard tech era. Like I do think there's saturation in like software and B2B SaaS outside of this sector. I think hardware is where we see like real prosperity made in the West in the next 20 years and where we see huge innovation. And I would like Stell to be kind of the service provider underpinning that growth and success. I was so frustrated as an engineer. Like you always had to know what exact document am I looking for? Let me go talk to Jason, the expert engineer, because he knows where it's stored. I want Stell to be this kind of super database of a company's engineering data, almost like your proprietary data set, where we then offer, that kind of AI search, really slick like references. And when you're building something new or you have a question or there's a failure, that's the first place you go and you search and Stell, how do I prevent micro cracking or what is the military spec for these bolts? And we provide an actually useful answer. Like that would be a game changer in terms of building these products.
What do you think is enabling the growth of hard tech startups right now? Like what is it that's happened where there's no question there's more entrepreneurs focused on these really really almost impossible problems.
I think it's really changes in the global landscape. So especially in my second year at business school, I took a lot of classes focused on competition with China in particular. And I think that is really the guiding principle behind like why we're seeing the revolution in hard tech and not just like actual defense products, but like we need to, have our own energy and we need to invest in nuclear. We're seeing things like that all driven by we're coming up against this looming great power competition where we may not have the hegemony that we had the last 20 years. I think really that's already gone and we're having to change very rapidly. And then I think in that potential conflict, we just have not to date been building products that would meet the moment and deter that, the competition becoming a conflict. So building those extremely quickly is very necessary. And so I think you're seeing founders step up to do it because, speaking to the government, it's very hard to like go through these traditional funding vehicles and actually bring this stuff to market. But I think venture capital investors and founders are stepping up to fill that gap at great personal risk. But I think it's super exciting. And I have so much respect for them and super grateful that we're seeing that community in LA, especially.
What would you be working on if it wasn't for Stell?
I think I would be working, well, I would want to be working at Anduril, probably on some of the high tech, like software, hardware combined programs. I said I was an intern there back in 2021, and it's just such an incredible company and talented group of people. And I think in terms of like new hardware in space and defense, like they have such a great recipe to bring a lot of that stuff to life. And so I'd probably be building hardware there.
So I have a question that I've actually asked on this show before, and I'm curious to get your thoughts. So I don't know how much time you spent with regards to NASA's approach to systems engineering, and you can say a lot about the current Artemis program and the delays and what have you, but obviously during the Apollo era, right, we built the Saturn V in 6 years, and it was I think 400,000 people working on those programs, and all they had were pieces of paper, right, and pens, effectively, right. There were not a ton of fancy tools that they had access to. What enabled, do you think, the agency to be so successful at meeting goals and maybe not hitting deadlines on the spot but being pretty quick at that time, and how has that Like, how do you think that that's evolved?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a high level, like tooling will not help you if you don't have a high level mandate and funding and like a clear mission to go execute on. I think in terms of spending, like the amount of budget we gave to NASA back then and the funding that went into these programs was relatively more significant than it is now. Like these suppliers that work on the new spacecraft, like they're very constrained in terms of like talent and requirements. There's not a lot of profit to be made downstream from like the initial OEM. And so I do think that's why we see a lot of delays and problems is like that top level mandate is a bit lacking. And whereas I think in the 1960s that was probably extremely strong and everybody kind of had this very core mission and mandate which was supported by management and government.
So you've seen a lot of different, startups. Obviously, you're in the community down in LA. Are there any aerospace startups that you're particularly excited about? Obviously, yours doesn't count.
Yeah, there's so many. I know so many, especially early stage founders here, and I just love getting to know them and then like following along each other on our journey and sharing struggles. I think in terms of startups, I would be excited about joining. I think Firefly is one that I would definitely look at. Their Victus Nox mission, which they recently flew out of Vandenberg for the Space Force, was just incredible. You could see it over LA and just how quickly they integrated that to meet this tactically responsive space, operating on weeks and days timeline versus years and months. To me, that was really one of the first moments where we've actually seen someone execute like a step change in how we will meet the mission need. A lot of people talk about faster, better, cheaper. And to me, this was like such a success between Space Force and a startup to actually make that a reality. So yeah, and everyone I meet there is just I think super nice. Their facility in Texas is just incredible, and I think they're going to have a lot of success.
So, are you going to open up a Birmingham office at one point?
If my parents are listening, there is potential for a Huntsville or Birmingham office, but Stell's going to have to get a lot bigger before then. So I better get back to work.
What do you think? What is the startup community look like in Huntsville? Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of history there.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's like this cool El Segundo startup venture capital funding environment, but people there are very entrepreneurial. Like our first customer, Onyx Aerospace, it started by this amazing entrepreneur, Steve Hanna. He was an engineer at NASA for years, and then he, started his own business to serve NASA and local clients. And so I think you see a lot of that. Like there are a lot of entrepreneurial people. I think the environment though is lacking a lot of that initial capital to bring products to life. So the companies do focus more on services. And I think it's just such it just speaks to the magic that we have out here and kind of the LA, Silicon Valley environment where we can find investors who want to take bets on young entrepreneurs building products because that's what really scales and really changes the underpinning of the industry.
Do you think building in LA was the best decision that you've made as far as location?
I think it's been great just in terms of, again, having those other founder relationships, the energy. Boston, people were kind of like, I'd say I worked in defense and they were like, you what? Like they were all doing like banking. They were all going to New York. They were working at McKinsey. They were like, what are you saying? And then I come to LA and it's like, it's very cool to do defense here. And yeah, I played 4 hours of beach volleyball this weekend. So in the sun and so in January. So like LA is pretty magical for that reason. And yeah, I just think like capital, talent, it's all great in California. So I think staying here long term will be great for Stell.
Yeah, well, amazing. Malory, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been a pleasure. And I can't wait to visit your Birmingham or Huntsville office one day.
Yeah, that sounds great. Payload happy hour, Huntsville, Alabama at the Stell office.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen.
Okay.
Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mo.